For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dana Harris, the Vice President of Federal and State Advocacy at the Austin Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank each of you for being here today, and I especially want to thank our partners, the San Marcos Chamber of Commerce, Google Fiber, KView, and of course our two candidates for joining us. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone here that we are both asking you to be respectful of both candidates. Please feel free to applaud when we welcome them to stage and at the conclusion of the debate. But we ask for silence during the debate out of respect for both of them and because this is being televised live beginning at noon. Please feel free to tweet and post on social media about the event during the debate, but make sure your phone is on silent, and our hashtag is VoteTexas. The Austin Chamber is proud to support voter engagement and provide an opportunity for you to learn more about the candidates for Texas 21st Congressional District. The Austin Chamber has a website, keepaustinvoting.com, where you can find out more about local and state elections. We look forward to an informative and substantive debate between Chip Roy and Joseph Kopser. With that, let's bring out our moderator, Ashley Goudeau, and the candidates, Joseph Kopser and Chip Roy.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, this is your one chance to talk, so get it out now. Good afternoon. I'm KView anchor and political reporter Ashley Goudeau, and we thank you for joining us here live in the Google Fiber space in downtown Austin. This very location sits within Texas District 21. It covers parts of downtown, south and southwest Austin, parts of southwestern Travis County, parts of Hayes County, and mainly just along and west of I-35, along with all of Blanco and Gillespie counties. It also stretches down towards San Antonio and further out into the hill country past our viewing area. And these two men want to represent the district in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, to my right is Mr. Joseph Kopser, and to my left, Mr. Chip Roy. Let's lay down some ground rules for today's debate. I, along with the leadership and input of the chamber, have devised questions for today's debate. We'll also take a few questions from voters, from some of you that were submitted earlier. Now, each candidate will have 1 minute to answer, along with a 30-second rebuttal if he chooses to use it. Once the question and answer portion is over, we'll give each candidate 3 minutes for closing statements. Now, to ensure our candidates stay on time, we are deploying a very high-tech, state-of-the-art device. It's called the ping pong paddle of time. Okay, the candidates will see a black side when they have 15 seconds. The red side means you must stop talking immediately because we must stay on time. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to hold the paddle. They say I'm too close to the candidates, may get to swinging, can't do that. So I'm going to pass it off to Christy Fogel, the Director of Operations for the Austin Chamber. She's going to be our Dean of Time, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give her a round of applause. She's going to keep us on track today. I know that you just heard it from Ms. Dana, but we want to remind you again that the audience is to remain quiet. There will be no applause, no cheering, no public displays of unhappiness, or you will be removed by a lovely member of the Austin Police Department. Now, a few minutes ago, we flipped a coin backstage and decided that the first question will go to Mr. Roy. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Describe for us what you believe to be the 3 most pressing issues for the constituents in District 21.
Thank you. We have how long?
3. You have 1 minute.
1 minute. So first of all, thank you all for being here. Thanks for hosting this. I do want to offer prayers for the folks in Llano. I think we've heard the bridge just collapsed down there, and you know, that's obviously going to be concerning for all of us as all these rains mount up. So prayers for them as we see this unfold. When I go across the district and have been just blessed to do so over the last 10 months, it's been very clear the people of Texas want is the opportunity to do what they do best and to live their lives free from interference from Washington. And on the front lines, making sure the federal government does its core job of securing the United States, securing our border, making sure our communities are secure, by making sure that we have the resources we need at the border and for our national defense. But importantly, that we have healthcare freedom, the ability to get the doctors of your choice. And this is the thing that I think is the most important, is making sure that we balance our budget, limit the federal government, and then get Washington out of the way to allow communities at home to make the decisions for our families and to do what's best for us. If you want to de-escalate the political rhetoric, if you want to stop focusing on what's going on in Washington, let's focus on Texas and California. Let Texas be Texas.
Okay. Mr. Roy?
Mr. Kopser, but yes,
Mr.
I like
Kopser.
it.
Sorry,
I
Joseph.
knew it was going to happen at some point today.
It's quite all right.
There it is. Okay.
So the three issues facing everyone is the issues that face all of us. It's jobs, it's education, it's our kids' future. But before I go any further, I too want to make sure that the people in the Hill Country, especially those affected by the flooding, heed the warnings of local officials. Specifically, if you see water, turn around and do not drown. But specifically, what we need to make sure is that no one is left behind as the economy continues to move into the 21st century. My experience in business, creating the jobs here in Texas as a member of the Austin Chamber of Commerce, know full well what's happening to this economy as too many Americans are left behind. So that education, that job training, we need to make sure that it's not just good K through 12 education, but it goes beyond that for 18 to 30 to 35-year-olds because they need the training, the certification, and the experience to be a part of the future. And then ultimately, for our kids' future, we need to fix healthcare once and for all and stop putting bumper stickers on it, but call it what it really needs to be, which is healthcare for all, and make it affordable so that everyone has the opportunities to be able to live secure and free lives.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about immigration. Immigration reform has been a topic of Washington for decades, and cries for change became louder when we saw those family separations happening at the border, as well as changes for Dreamers and to DACA. Begin by telling us what you would like to see done to address immigration.
Does that go to Joseph, since I did the last one first?
It's going to go to you first.
Okay. Not sure how we're alternating. So immigration is something that's obviously front and center here in Texas, and particularly in San Antonio, in this district, we see firsthand some of the implications. I've gotten to know Lori Vargas. She's the mother of Jared Vargas, who unfortunately lost his life in June at the hands of an illegal immigrant. Somebody who had come through the system, had been found, let go, let go again, and then ultimately murdered Jared in June. I've gotten to know Lori, and she believes rightly that we can stop that. The United States of America is the most powerful nation the world has ever known. It's our sovereign responsibility to secure the border. And that's not just in our interest as the Texans that are on the front lines of this and dealing with MS-13 and cartels who have control of our border. But it's really fundamentally important for the immigrants who are unfortunately getting sold into the sex trafficking business, riding on the top of train cars, moms dying in the desert, because we do not our responsibility as a sovereign nation to secure our border, but rather in the false name of compassion have open borders that is causing that environment in the first place.
So we can actually do both, which is to be a beacon of hope around the world to allow those immigrants seeking better life, those who want to work here, and those seeking asylum, and we can process them and figure out the best way for their future going forward. We can also keep our borders secure and do both. And any politician that uses fear-mongering to say that it is gangs and crime that prevent us from making progress fall into the trap of the D.C. swamp for the last 40 years. It was Ronald Reagan in 1986 who had the last major reform on immigration, and I want to work together, move past the fear-mongering. My opponent won't say it publicly, but in his emails, he misrepresents my views on immigration, saying that I'm for open borders and sending money away overseas. The reality is that Dennis Nixon, president of IBC Bank, a CEO, and Trump supporter, has one of the smartest plans that don't require a border wall, don't require separating families, but can make sure that the business community and new Americans are welcomed in a way that fear-mongering will never get us to.
If I might add just a couple thoughts, with all due respect to my opponent, he forgets it on his website. And in numerous statements he has made about taking assets and dollars and resources away from Border Patrol, the very Border Patrol that's sitting on our border right now, not without the resources that they need to secure the border, full well knowing that the cartels have operational control of our border, and you go down and talk to them. They don't have a radio signal. They don't have a cell signal. Of the 72 miles of the Laredo sector, 2 miles are navigable. 2 miles are navigable by cars that can go along the Rio Grande. They don't have the resources they need, and my opponent has suggested taking those resources away. So with all due respect, I disagree with that.
Mr. Kopser, would you like to use your 30-second rebuttal?
Absolutely. So when we talk about the border, since I don't know if he's actually read my website, there's 52 pages of policy that I encourage you to look at. But very specifically, when it comes to immigration, what I have said in speeches publicly in front of Democrats and Republicans is let's figure out the source of the problem, a Marshall-like plan for Central America, because they are going to continue to come until we help those countries solve it. I'm not taking money away from Border Patrol. I'm trying to make sure that we allocate the resources to be able to strengthen those economies, or else those people will continue to come north, and that is going to be nothing but causing trouble going forward.
Mr. Kopser, we'll begin with you on this question. President Donald Trump remains very vocal and adamant about his desire to build a wall along our border, including a large part of Texas. Where do you stand on the idea of a border wall?
We do not need a border wall. The geography doesn't support it. The landowners across the border do not want it. What we know we can have is common sense solution, and there's two ways. As I reported, Dennis Nixon, the president of IBC Bank, he lays out very practical things. First and foremost, at our border entry points, increase capacity. Make it so that there are more judges that allow us to be able to adjudicate all those cases coming over. And then in between the border entry points, we know that it is indeed those coming to traffic to do harm through drugs and sex and weapons. But we have new technologies pioneered in the military that I served in so proudly for 20 years that understand that if those people are coming in between those border entry points, it makes it easier for Border Patrol to include things like eliminating the carrizo cane and the salt cedar. It's a very pragmatic approach to doing it. It's good for business, good for people, but it's not fear-mongering, and that's what you won't find me doing.
Mr. Roy, where do you stand on the idea of a border wall?
Well, there's no question that physical barriers work, and so we need physical barriers to make sure we improve security at the border. Look no further than Southern California. In the mid-1990s, there was no barriers on a good portion of the southern border, and we had upwards of 600,000, mid-600,000 apprehensions in the mid-1990s. They built triple-layer fencing. That's now down to about 30,000 apprehensions per year. And people say, well, it doesn't work, because people come to Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Well, that proves that they do work. It doesn't necessarily mean we need one at every mile along the border, but I do know that we need physical barriers. We need to improve the ability of our Border Patrol agents to move along the Rio Grande, have roads that go along the river, clear out the cane, we agree. But these are solutions you can do if you work with the community locally to put barriers where they need to be. The barriers might work. And at the end of the day, what we know is that there was a bill this summer that would have gone a long ways to doing that, and not a single Democrat supported it. It would have secured the border, reformed our immigration system, and it would have actually dealt with status in ways I might not have fully agreed with, but it would have actually moved the needle, and not a single Democrat supported it.
Let's begin with you on our next question. Data released last month confirms Texas still has the highest number of uninsured residents in the country. This becomes a cost passed on to taxpayers in more ways than one. What are your ideas on addressing health care?
Well, thank you. This is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I'm glad my parents here, Don and Rhonda Roy, are here joining me, and my dad is a polio survivor. He had polio when he was 7 years old and has been living with it his whole life, has a tracheostomy as a result of that. I'm a cancer survivor. I had Hodgkin's lymphoma, stage 3, when I had a 4-month-old daughter and a 2-year-old son, both of whom are here today, and I'm glad to see them 9 and 7 now. We've got to fix our healthcare system. It's badly broken. I believe that it is badly broken in significant part because Obamacare took a lot of the decision-making out of our hands and our ability to access health care and get the doctors of our choosing, get the health care of our choosing. And as a result, we've shoved 15 million people into Medicaid rolls, which is now making it more difficult for the people who want to get access to care through Medicaid, and it's driving up costs. Costs are now out of control. Insurance premiums are now 2 and 3 times what they were just before Obamacare. We now have people who can't get access to their doctors because we've got barriers in the way. We can solve that by having direct primary care, health savings accounts, health sharing organizations and ministries, and ways that you can get costs down. But if you don't get costs down, you can't fix the healthcare system.
Mr. Kopser.
So I believe fundamentally that we should have health care for all. What we need to focus on is making sure that there is enough coverage for everyone. No one should be concerned about filling a prescription or filling their pantry. We need to reduce costs long term by getting more preventative care. But what we have to do is get past the fear-mongering. I want to be very clear, very clear. Health care for all means that if you are in a situation where you leave a job like my opponent did when he left the state government, he then went to work for Ted Cruz's super PAC. He took with his health care with him. I applaud him for taking his health care. I would have done that too. But what was not right was for him to take that taxpayer-provided health care and then turn around and work against the 380,000 Texans with pre-existing conditions that were no longer be covered. That's not being a hypocrite, or as I like to say, it's being a chypocrite. I want to fix this problem once and for all.
I reckon I'll respond.
I imagined you would.
So, first of all, I took no benefit that wasn't earned. Second of all, talk to my family about the $1,900 a month COBRA payment that my family endured to be able to pay for health care because our system is broken because Democrats broke it. Democrats took a system where you could go out in the market and be able to get health care and made it worse. If you want to solve the problem, then put money in the pockets of the American people, allow them to go get health care in the market so you can get the doctor you're choosing without an insurance bureaucrat or a government bureaucrat getting in the way. That's what we need to do, and that's what we'll do if I get to Congress.
But it doesn't apply the what next. The what next is what happens for those Americans that can't afford that $1,900 COBRA pay. I'm asking what next? These health savings ministry accounts, if you come in with pre-existing conditions, you can't get into most of them. What next? So egregious was that earned plan that he had that he took that the Texas legislature actually passed a law allowing no one else to do that, like the 3 people from indicted Ken Paxton's office that he was a part of that came out and did that. It's a sweetheart deal. You shouldn't have to be working for Ken Paxton to get a sweetheart deal. All Texans should be covered.
We will move on now to the next question. Mr. Kopser, we'll begin with you. The shooting massacre at Santa Fe High School recalled those cries for stricter gun laws across our state and our country. First and foremost, do you see a need for some gun reform, and if so, what?
So as a 20-year Army military vet, a 2-time combat tour veteran of Iraq, I understand what weapons of war were designed to do. I understand the violence and lethality. But I think we can take pragmatic approaches to be able to keep them out of the hands of the wrong people. No good, law-abiding, Second Amendment, gun-owning citizen has any problem to worry about with me as a representative. What I want to do is keep guns out of the hands of terrorists, criminals, those that beat their family, and those that are not in their right state of mind. What we can do to prevent the tragedies that you described and so many more of the past and hopefully lessen them in the future is have common sense gun reform without the fear-mongering that comes from my opponent who runs around in his newsletters and tells everybody that I'm out to take their guns. Or Ted Cruz calling me a gun grabber. I'll tell you when I grabbed a gun. Every time I left my vehicle in combat, I grabbed my gun. Every time I left the wire to go out in the streets of Iraq, I grabbed my gun, but not those of Texans. Let's be very clear on the record.
So I just want to push a little bit. You said common sense, but you didn't give us examples of what you mean. What
no fly, no buy. If you're on the no-fly list, you should be on the no-buy list. People say, well, that list is broken. Well, I'm a problem solver. Fix the list. Don't allow that to be an excuse. Secondly, we have to close the loopholes. People say, oh, we can't do instant background checks. Give me a break. I've come up from the tech industry and business. We can swipe your credit card with Square and get all that information in seconds. We can do the same thing with a good background check solution. And thirdly, we have to study mental health and its connection to violence. If we understand that better, we can reduce the number of guns being involved in violent situations by improving mental health care overall.
Mr. Roy, do you see a need for gun reform, and if so, what?
Well, first and foremost, we all recognize that we have God-given rights, and one of those is our ability to defend our families and defend our nation under the Second Amendment. What I find interesting is that my opponent seems to have morphed a bit from his primary race to his general election race, when his website during the primary said, quote, "The only reason a private citizen can accurately use or justify owning an assault-style weapon or high-capacity magazine is that he or she is seeking to commit mass murder and violence on innocent American lives." So that was the quote from the primary. Now, his website amended for the general. "I cannot imagine any reason why someone would want to buy assault weapons and large capacity magazines," i.e. it's been softened. The rhetoric has been softened. We're going to talk about fear-mongering. I think if you want to look at the issue, we know what we can do. We can secure our schools. My children were in a school where the bombs went off here in Austin within a mile of the school. I know how parents and families reacted to that, and Dad showed up the next day and we were working to figure out how to better secure our schools. These are things that we can do if we just focus on the common sense problems. And as a former federal prosecutor who prosecuted gang members, prosecuted people who had weapons they weren't supposed to have, I can tell you the laundry list of items that my opponent just outlined that are already unlawful under federal law. And you've got prosecutors out there working hard to put them behind bars when they're misusing weapons for whatever reason they misuse them under law.
So is that a yes or a no? You think we need some level of gun reform?
I think we need to continue to improve the laws we have now to put people who violate those laws behind bars and to make sure that those don't have weapons who should have weapons. But we also got to look at how broken our civil society is. If you look at the reports and the studies, bans on assault weapons by left-leaning organizations were found to have done no real good in the 10 years when we had that ban in place. But importantly, 75% of the people who have committed some of these crimes in recent times have come from broken homes without a father, with rampant drug abuse and domestic abuse. These are problems that are causing the problems that we ought to be focused on.
Okay. We'll begin with you with our next question. While the U.S. House does not play a role in U.S. Supreme Court nominee confirmations, the hearings for Justice Brett Kavanaugh dominated the news for the past month, raising a lot of questions about the process. Does the process work the way it's supposed to?
I had the pleasure of serving on the United States Senate Judiciary Committee as a lawyer, representing Texans on behalf of, as a lawyer for Senator John Cornyn. I saw this process worked on a bipartisan basis with friends of mine in Senator Leahy's office, hardly a big conservative, a Democrat from Vermont, friends in Senator Feinstein's office. We were able to work together, and you deal with these issues behind the scenes. What we saw unfold a few weeks ago is an indication of what we will see in the United States House of Representatives if the House goes to Democrats next year. You will see impeachment proceedings, not just against Kavanaugh, but against the President of the United States, as my opponent has publicly said he would support, already prejudging our job in the House of Representatives on a question like that. So I think that we need to look at it from the standpoint of what the American people want, which is due process, making sure that people are innocent until proven guilty. We saw that process unfold in a politicized manner that was driven specifically in a way that undermined our judiciary, undermined faith in the system, and frankly undermined both Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Ford. It was an unfortunate circumstance, but the American people saw through it.
Okay. Mr. Kopser, did the process work the way it was supposed to?
No, it did not, because the politics of D.C. have become so entrenched in tribes that the people on opposite ends of the teams are so concerned with scoring their political points than actually doing the right thing. It is the more time that you spend in Washington, D.C., the more that just creeps in on you. Now, I know that in his heart, my opponent is a good person. But just as Matthew Dowd said, the more time you spend living in a building with mold and asbestos, the more likely it is to affect how you live, think, and breathe. And that is what's happened in Washington, where they weaponized the tragedy of a woman's sexual assault, and more importantly, her inability to be able to speak out or remain silent, her choice. That weaponization, regardless of political party, is what we have as a symptom. My opponent has spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., whether it's the Republican team or the Democratic team, it doesn't matter. I want a new generation of leadership who don't come with all that baggage to be able to fix the problems we have in D.C. today.
Mr. Kopser, Central Texas is one of the fastest growing regions in America, with thousands of people moving to our city and our region each month. And that, of course, means more traffic. In fact, the I-35 corridor through the Austin region is ranked as the second most congested in the state by the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Now, one of the ways to pay for expensive transportation infrastructure is with toll lanes. Should toll lanes be a part of the Central Texas infrastructure plan?
So the easy answer is you always get what you pay for. Texans are going to figure out, like everybody else, that if we want to spend more time in traffic without building the infrastructure around roads and high-speed transit and more bus and dedicated lanes, if we don't fix the problems, we're going to choke off the success we have in this region, not just in Austin, but in San Antonio. Toll lanes should be a part of the mix. What we should do is right-price transportation, but more importantly, we need to bring practitioners who have been there. The success that I had in the private sector after leaving the Army was in transportation. I worked not only with the Chambers of Commerce of here, but of San Marcos and all throughout the I-35 corridor for real solutions, not running to the corner of political ideology, but instead taking business-like approaches to be able to figure out how to enable more people to gain access. Because mobility is not just about ground mobility, it's about upward mobility in society, and our transportation is limiting that today.
Mr. Roy, should toll lanes be a part of the Central Texas infrastructure plan?
Well, I think when you look at the question that would be before either of us in the United States Congress, were we to be elected, then the question becomes, what is the federal government's role in that, right? A lot of what we've been talking about, issue by issue, is something that largely should be being discussed right up the street, right up here Congress Avenue in the Texas legislature, or in our local communities, in our counties, figuring out how we better Texas. Texas is the 10th largest economy in the world. Texas can figure out how to solve its problem. But here's what's interesting. Of the $4 billion that Texas sends up to Washington, $3.5 billion we get back, i.e. there's a $500 million deficit in the dollars that we're sending out of Texas versus what we're getting back. That ought to stop. The money ought to be here for us to use. We ought to be able to keep our Texas dollars in Texas to be able to deal with infrastructure needs like we clearly are going to face in Central Texas with the massive growth in Austin and San Antonio. San Marcos and New Braunfels are going to be like Arlington is to Dallas and Fort Worth. We've got lots of things we can solve. And mass transit and tolls and traditional highways should all be a part of the mix. But we ought to be able to deal with that issue right here in Texas with the resources and the entrepreneurial capability and the leadership we have in this state.
Mr. Roy, we'll start with you again. Last year, President Trump signed an overhaul of our nation's tax code into law. Now, critics say the cuts are too generous to big businesses and wealthy Americans, but supporters argue the cuts will be good and benefit Americans and increase wages for everyone. Where do you stand on the cuts and why?
So I think it's critically important that resources stay in the pockets of the entrepreneurs and the job creators throughout the United States. That's particularly true here in Texas. We were languishing as a country for too long in stagnant 1% and 2% economic growth. And by unleashing the economy, we're now looking at 4.x% economic growth right now. You're seeing the benefit of that. Jobless claims at all-time lows. Unemployment rates among Americans at all-time lows, particularly among Black and Hispanic Americans. You get that when you get job creation and economic growth, when you leave money and resources in the hands of the job creators. Absolutely, we can figure out how to continue to improve our tax code. I think it ought to be permanent, so you can invest your assets appropriately, both for individuals and businesses. I think we should make further improvements to state taxes so that our farmers and people that inherit wealth from their families can do so. But there's no question that leaving money in the hands of the people is the way you create wealth, jobs, and growth in this country, and so I fully support that.
Mr. Kopser?
So as the job creator on the stage, I want to push back just a little bit, which is to clarify the point that the Texas Association of Business, the Austin Chamber of Commerce, of which I'm both a member of, have a lot of different ways to look at this last tax bill. But one that almost the entire the entire business community agrees is that we went too far down in the corporate tax rate. 25% was pretty much what everybody agreed that we needed and we wanted. But for political reasons, we went down below that to 21%. Now, the Republican-led efforts to do that have added $1.5 trillion to the debt, and they're talking now about making those middle-class tax cuts that they didn't even make permanent, that they sold them as this great thing for the middle class. Yes, every $1,000 and $2,000 is great, but they weren't permanent. It was an attempt to once again divide and chip away at Obamacare by removing the personal mandate. This was nothing more than a mean plan that was more than even the business community was asking for.
So,
No,
go ahead, you can do your rebuttal.
Well, I was just going to offer a couple more thoughts, which is that, you know, again, with all due respect, and I respect my opponent immensely in his service in our military, and I too believe he's got strong motives and is a good man looking to serve publicly. But he has not met a tax he doesn't like. I mean, he wants to get rid of the tax cuts we got last December. He wants to add a carbon tax. He wants to add a financial transaction tax, all of which would harm economic growth. And importantly, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. I mean, it's been consistent over our history where we're seeing that we're just blowing past the revenues that we have regardless of what those revenues are. So we've got to get control of spending. 100% agree on that, but it's not the right way to go at it by increasing taxes on job creators.
Would you like to respond?
Oh, absolutely. We have to invest in the infrastructure of this country. It was Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower who pushed forth the National Highway Infrastructure Act that connected all of the states. It's one thing if he wants to let the states be their own, but if they can't interconnect and create commerce and trade, we wouldn't have the Texas economic miracle that we have. And forgetting that is part of the problem. And what I want to make sure, especially when he talks about the carbon tax, is to set it correct. It is carbon pricing. It is two Republicans pushing for it, and it is the oil companies that are on board with it. So don't let the misrepresentation get in the way of reality.
Okay. Mr. Kopser, we'll begin with you again. Members of the Republican Party, including some representatives from Texas, are pushing for even more tax cuts. Are you for or against additional tax cuts, and why?
Here's what I want to do. I want to tax appropriately and fairly. I want to make sure we're taxing wealth, not work. We've heard the story so many times that Warren Buffett's secretary is taxed at a higher tax bracket than he himself. It's because our tax code is slanted towards the wealthiest Americans. And if we understand that that tax bill that we were just talking about is actually set up so that by the year 2027, 90% of all the gains go to the top 10% of wealthiest Americans and corporations, that's not fair taxes. What that's doing is this new line in the far right and the extremes, which is I got mine. I got to the top of the ladder, I got mine. I got through good public schools 20 years ago, I got mine. What I want to do is make sure that all Americans have the opportunity to participate in that American dream, not just those that got fast-tracked early and now they've got theirs.
Mr. Roy, more cuts. You on board or not?
Well, what I'm in favor of, as I mentioned before, is making the tax cuts permanent and continuing to simplify the tax code. That, I think, are the most important things that need to be done. We got to stop getting off this seesaw, this yo-yo of doing tax cuts that then expire and then you're fighting over them again in 5 or 10 years. Let's get tax rates in place that businesses can rely upon, that people can rely upon, that people can figure out how to set up their estates and do whatever they need to do for their families. And then importantly, we've just got to focus on making sure that people have jobs. And the best way to do that is to have money in the hands of the American people, the job creators, and then they create wealth and they pass that down to their children and their grandchildren, and then they live the American dream. My family, my great-great-grandfather lost his farm in the Depression. My grandmother then she was a single mom and ran for county clerk in Nolan County, Texas, became the first woman elected to do so. Passed that down. My dad was the first to go to college. Now I was the first to go to college and then graduate school. That's how the American dream works. And you work hard each generation to pass down to the next something better than you inherited from your family.
I just got to respond to that too.
Sir.
I understand the need to keep money in the hands of those that create opportunity and create jobs and build companies. I am one of those people. But I could not have built this company if I did not have a trained and ready workforce, if I didn't have access to the internet and technologies, if I didn't have the rule of law to protect the patents and the information we were doing. All of those take government involvement, and all of those do take money. Now, I'm not going to be the person up here and tells you we have to tax and spend our way through everything like my opponent is painting me as. I'm just being very matter of fact about how we get the country we have today, which is investing in the future.
Would you like to use your 30 seconds?
The only thing I would add is that we absolutely need to have a trained workforce. There's a lot we can do to improve our education system for vocational training, things that will meet the needs of businesses that need to hire people to do jobs. We need welders and plumbers and all sorts of things that our education system is not doing what it needs to do. But these are all issues that, with all due respect, run for state rep, run for state senate, have this debate right here in the Texas legislature. But in Congress, we should be focused on securing the country and having a stable economic environment nationwide and then getting largely out of the way. There's nothing that Texas can't do as the 10th largest economy in the world by ourselves.
Okay. Mr. Roy, our current national debt is $21 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the new tax cuts will increase the national deficit by $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Do you think that national debt is a threat to our economy? And if so, what will you do to address it if you're elected?
Well, it's a great question, and I do think it's fundamentally important. I mean, our national defense leaders, Mattis has said it, I think others in our Department of Defense have talked about how our national debt is actually the biggest threat to our national security. $21.5 trillion of debt compared to the $20.5 trillion of debt that we had as a country when Joseph and I started running last year. That's unconscionable. We can solve it. We solve it like everybody in this room does, like the state of Texas does. We have $3.5 trillion of income. Go figure out what you need to defend the United States with our military, secure our border. That's about $1 trillion. Go look at what our obligations are under Medicare and Social Security, people who rely on it. Make sure those are met, and then take what you've got left and figure out the remaining things you need to do as a federal government, and then step back, let the laboratories of democracy and the people and commerce and jobs take over. But you got to get busy balancing the budget. And my position is that Congress, when they meet in January, should do nothing. They shouldn't leave Washington until they've passed a 5-year balanced budget and then appropriated to that budget. They literally shouldn't leave town until they get that done.
Mr. Kopser.
So let me pick up on the first part of his phrase. I'm going to take it in a different direction. When he says that Congress should be doing nothing when he gets there. Now, I know he said pass the balanced budget, but the problem that we have today in our politics is this entrenched bureaucracy where people run to their sides. So something like solving the problem of the debt that we have is because no political party is willing to stand up and have the courage to be able to talk about the tough choices to make. And I can be critical of Democrats and Republicans alike. It is the very fact that we sent this nation to war for the last 17 plus years and did not ask for the shared sacrifice or even the revenue to pay for this war, but simply to add it to the debt. It is not one party's fault or the other. It is both parties that have been in Congress, and I want a new generation of people in Congress, not those that have been there so long that they have that bitter team rivalry going to the point they're not able to cross the aisles. I've said this before. If I can cross oceans and deserts in service to my country, I can cross the aisle when needed to work with the people in Washington to solve these problems like the debt.
Okay. We'll begin with you again. In March, President Trump implemented 25% tariffs on some of America's allies in trade, who in turn placed tariffs on American products. Now, just last month, the president announced $200 billion worth of tariffs on China, and in an interview Sunday night, he said, quote, he might impose more. Many people believe this will lead to a harmful and prolonged trade war with increased prices for many goods and services that Americans rely on. What is your position on the president's tariffs?
It is reckless, and what is happening is the Republican Party is allowing, and I'm speaking mainly of the far right side of it, that is allowing the president to take them down a road, and then worse, to take this country down a road that 40 years ago we all agreed wasn't right. It was President Ronald Reagan that pushed for the early conditions that led to NAFTA. It is NAFTA that has helped this state in a way in order to increase trade and commerce. That is what we need, fair and free trade, not entering into a trade war. Because what the president doesn't tell you and the Republicans forget is that those tariffs are actually are paid by Americans when they buy the more expensive goods. And so what we have to do is figure out how to work with our allies. I know what the word ally means. It's countries that also see the world the same that we do, to be able to reduce those. And if I can agree with the Wall Street Journal that new revised NAFTA, while not being a better plan, at least didn't do worse harm, is progress, well, that's one area where there's actually something we can agree on.
Mr. Roy?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I believe free trade is foundational. We should have free trade throughout the world. It's massively improved our lives in the United States, and particularly in Texas. Texas has benefited to the tune of $300 billion of economic growth since NAFTA was passed. And it's been hugely important to our economy and to the ability of Americans throughout the country to be able to access goods affordably and to drive our economy. We should sustain that. I do think the president of either party, no matter who's in office, should be given latitude to go negotiate on our behalf. In this case, for example, with respect to NAFTA, he's gone out and negotiated a new deal. I haven't looked at the fine print of the deal. Would want to do so before making a decision of whether I would support that, because Congress's job is to check the president, make sure that it's in the interest of this district, in the interest of Texas, and would want to look at the details of it. Did we give up stuff in order to get improvements to dairy trade in the north of Canada or something? I don't know. I need to look at it in detail. But I do think the president ought to be given the latitude to negotiate, and then Congress checks that and makes decisions about whether it's in the best interest of the country.
But specifically when we speak about his tariffs, for or against those?
Well, I think that what you need to make sure we focus on is negotiating in the best interest of the United States and deciding whether or not these tariffs are good net-net. In some instances, tariffs are important to establish the right, free, and fair trade that my opponent was referring to. In some instances, they overstep. I think in some of the cases we're seeing right now, I've got some concerns with some of the tariffs that we're talking about with respect to China and other places. But I do think it's really critically important that we remember that we have to have the president be able to go out and negotiate, and then Congress check the president. We've got to get back to, frankly, making Article 1 Congress great again, reinstating the power of the people's representatives to check the president and the judiciary.
You've touched on this just momentarily before, but I'm going to continue with my question anyway. It's on NAFTA. I'm sure you guys could guess that. The Texas economy relies heavily on NAFTA, and as you are aware, a new deal was reached between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Among other things, it includes a focus on North American-made automotive parts, tariffs on cars, and wages for auto workers. Of course, Congress will have to approve the deal before it can be enacted. So, Mr. Roy, if you had to take a vote for or against it right now, how would you vote?
On the New Deal?
The New Deal.
Don't know. I need to look at it. That's the job of a member of Congress, is to read the deal and look at the fine print. What I've read in reports, what I understand from Wall Street Journal reporting and otherwise, is that I do think it was largely in keeping with the spirit of NAFTA that has benefited Texas and benefited the United States economy over the last 20 years, and that we shouldn't undermine. But you got to look at the details to make sure that it's in our interest. I do know that some of the improvements that might affect certain other parts of the country may or may not benefit Texas. I want to look at that in close detail and make sure that it is as strong as NAFTA has been over the last 20 years. But again, give the president and give the executive branch the authority that they should have to be able to go out and negotiate, look at the fine print, look at the deal. It'll be before Congress. We'll look at it, we'll vote on it, and see whether it's make sure it's in the best interest of Texas.
Mr. Kopser, if you had to vote for or against it right now, are you prepared to say which way you would vote?
Yes, I'm with the business community. I'm with Dennis Nixon at IBC Bank. I'm with the Wall Street Journal, which is, oh, thank goodness it wasn't any worse than it could have been. In January, our markets went on a slide because the president, with no warning, came out and started going at Canada and Mexico without listening to the experts. See, I believe in doing this thing called leading with science and facts and data, not waiting to see how I might wake up in the morning and decide. And that is where, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, they said, well, it mainly affects dairy farmers and automobile makers, and if the president just needs to go out and slap a new name on NAFTA, just give it to him and hope that he backs away and doesn't hurt the economy any more than that opening salvo against the Canadians did. What I want to see is a return of calm instead of the chaos, and I certainly don't want to be excusing reckless behavior on the international scene that can do harm to Americans, both financially and potentially national security.
Okay. Now, prior to today, we invited voters to submit questions for the candidates. We're going to get to some of those now. Mr. Lucas Schaefer asks, due to gerrymandering, whoever wins will be representing a sizable number of people he passionately disagrees with. Mr. Kopser, we will begin with you. How will you reach out to those citizens?
I already have. I already do. As I mentioned before, I grew up a Ronald Reagan Republican. I was fiercely independent in my 20 years in the military, and only running for office did I declare as a Democrat because I don't recognize the direction it's going. But it's Republicans in this state, like Joe Strauss, is a good example of members of the opposite party that do know how to talk to people of the opposite party. Joe Strauss and what he did to push back on the far right ended up getting him censured by his own Republican Party of Texas. And then those people behind bills like the bathroom bill and organizations like Empower Texas, that the Texas Association Business, of which I was a part of, came out and fought and pushed against and said those are not Texas values. I was so proud to stand with them and alongside Joe Strauss and others to be able to push back. So I can work across the aisle. I can speak to people who I disagree with because I've done it my entire life.
Mr. Roy?
Well, I'm proud of my background in both the private sector and the public sector. I have had the benefit of working in investment banking, oil and gas community, and other job-creating environments, but also in public sector as a federal prosecutor, for Assistant Attorney General, and yes, on Capitol Hill for a few years. In that job, I had the great and extraordinary blessing of working with friends on both sides of the aisle, have had experience already in working to pass bills on a bipartisan basis, work with friends to help deal with the Wright Amendment and deal with traffic in and out of Dallas-Fort Worth back to D.C., deal with copyright laws and other issues on a bipartisan basis. And the vast majority of legislation is passed on a bipartisan basis. In fact, 800 bills last year were passed in the United States House of Representatives, often unreported, on a bipartisan basis. What's important here, in my view, is to de-escalate politics in Washington by refocusing our attention on empowering people at the state and local level to live our lives. Let's make sure our make sure we're secure nationally, make sure our borders are secure, make sure we have healthcare freedom, and let's get Texas free from Washington interference by getting Washington out of the way and de-escalate politics in the process.
Can I just add to that?
You
Or
have
rebut
your 30 seconds.
I want to be very clear. We talk about evidence of working across the aisle. And as my opponent says, he is very proud of his public and private professional career. But I don't see that. Literally, on his website, he has 285 words in his biography. I have 4,500 words in my biography. And as a professional in the business community, I find it very strange. He doesn't even have a LinkedIn profile. I do not know what he is hiding. I do not know what he's not wanting you to see in that career, but I want to make sure that you see examples of working across the aisle through both careers, and I encourage him to open that up.
I'm sure you would like to respond.
Well, I'm just glad that LinkedIn is the magic silver bullet to the success of the United States of America. Good to know that. We'll make sure we work on that. And if word length or the number of words is the solution to America's problems, then he'll fit right in Washington.
Moving on to our next question. It comes from Jody Mixon. She says STEM is focused on retaining science skills in this country. Once elected, how do you plan to continue promoting STEM to ensure our youth are riding the wave? Mr. Roy, we will begin with you.
Well, this is not going to surprise folks when I explain that my view on education is that we need to make these decisions in Texas. At the Department of Education, I think, takes money and resources away from Texas taxpayers, interferes with our ability at the state and local level to be able to educate children according to the interest of parents and the interest of local communities and the interest of Texas, and that we can do vastly improved things in Texas if we'll free up opportunities and free up competition and have more options for the people throughout Texas and have choice and have the ability of more charter schools and choice and alternatives for parents. I think that ought to all be decided at the state and local level. I think we should save the money that we're currently spending in Washington. I mean, for goodness sake, we put a man on the moon in 1969, 10 years before the Department of Education was ever created. And the Department of Education has done no real value in adding to the improvement of education in the United States of America. It's only detracted from the ability of Texans and people and families to be able to take care of their own families and have the best education for job creators and for the people we need in Texas.
STEM is a great area to differentiate between rhetoric and reality. When I was building my company, we were so starved for having more technical and skilled talent that I had to spend sometimes with recruiting firms as much as $25,000 a candidate to move here from other states. That is the reality of the business community, not the rhetoric, the reality of the business community here in Texas. There is a role to ensure we're doing more with STEM. And as I grew that company, we did not have enough women applicants. I said, what is the problem? And the problem is the pipeline. So rather than just talk about the rhetoric, I did something in reality, which is my wife and I invested in a program here locally called Girls Start, to take girls in the 4th and 5th grade to inspire them with the confidence and knowledge they know they can do well going forward through that buzzsaw of middle school. So you can either look at the rhetoric or the reality of how you work STEM, and I want to work in the reality of increasing STEM opportunities.
Our next question comes from Lucy Frost, who wants to know, what are the first steps you take toward a more balanced federal budget? Mr. Kopser, we'll begin with you.
So the first thing we have to do is increase the economy. You can look at Indeed.com, a local Texas company headquartered right here, and talk about the thousands upon thousands of job openings. And I agree, the economy is red hot, and it has grown ever since we came out of the recession in 2008, and the trajectory is for it to continue. But we have so many people who have fallen out of the economy. They lack the jobs and education and training. But even if we took every American and put them into the opening jobs, we would still have more need for workers, which is why balancing the budget includes a new opportunity to increase the new Americans working in our companies, being a part of this economic miracle and keeping it going. And secondly, healthcare costs. To balance the budget, we got to bring down those costs. Since the plan Obamacare was passed, which by the way was built on the foundation of a Republican plan, Republicans used every chance they could to just chip away at it, and I want to make sure that we reduce those costs by providing care to everyone and focus on preventative care.
Mr. Roy.
Well, first, we do have to continue to grow the economy so you can grow out of debt. The current amount of debt compared to the size of our economy is actually now exceeding that of what we had at the end of World War II, right? The only other time that we've had as much debt as we've had compared to our the size of our economy. So we got to grow our economy, and we're on the right path to doing that right now by getting the regulatory state, the tax environment such that it can help create wealth and create the kind of revenue that you get from growth. But importantly, you've just got to get busy balancing the budget, and that takes resolve and the seriousness to do it. The President's Office of Management budget sent a 5-year balanced budget up to the Congress last year, And members on both sides of the aisle laughed it back down to the White House. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't sit down and work through to figure out how you're going to balance the budget. There are a number of different ways you can get there. There are penny plans. There are ways you can do across-the-board cuts. You can go through and target zero-based budgeting so you can get to where you need to go. But you just got to sit down and have the resolve to do it. That's why I believe when Congress meets in January, they ought to take a step back. They ought to stop passing any other legislation until they've passed a 5-year balanced budget and appropriated to that budget. And then do it like the American people in the state of Texas does.
If I may, can I just push back? I love my opponent's new sense of restored bipartisanship. The tone that he has taken from the primary to now is wonderful, and I welcome it. But to talk about coming together to solve these problems, from the very architect of the 2013 government shutdown, with his boss at the time, Ted Cruz, had ramifications all throughout our government. Not just harmful to those men and women that relied on the opportunity and the free flow of government contracts, or more importantly, the supply chain in and out of the private sector, but more importantly, what it did to the tone in Washington. So I'm glad he's coming to the bipartisan way of things. I just hope it continues past November 6th.
Would you like to respond?
Well, would that we had succeeded in 2013 so that the American people wouldn't be facing what they're facing with health care. My opponent likes to use the phrase, what then, or what next? And I would like to say that that's the most important question we should be asking for all of the people to whom President Obama promised no increases in their health care premiums and that they wouldn't lose their doctors. And yet the reality is that has occurred. Those are the facts. And we knew that when we were trying to stop the funding of Obamacare because we knew how damaging it would be to the ability for people to get access to the doctors they're choosing and the care of their choosing. So I'm proud to have done that. Happy in my experience of working across the aisle to achieve lots of great accomplishments for the state of Texas in my past.
Our final question comes from an anonymous member of the voter who asked, what will you do in Congress to ensure there's not another financial crisis like in 2008 if there is a decline in housing prices or other unexpected crisis? Mr. Roy, we'll begin with you.
Well, I think this is something where we learned a lot in 2008. I did not agree with the too big to fail rhetoric of the time. I believe that it's important that we make some structural changes to the overreaction to the crisis in 2008 and 2009 through Dodd-Frank. And you talk to any bank in this district of any size, frankly, they see how much it's constraining the ability of banks to be able to provide lending for job creators and for people, farmers, people in rural parts of the district, people in the cities. And we need to make sure we fundamentally reform our financial system. There are a lot of things that we could do to avoid the issues that we dealt with in 2008. But importantly, this idea that too big to fail was something that then drove the policy making, I think has actually harmed and made the situation worse by constraining the ability to have lots of small and medium-sized banks so that you don't have it concentrated in the wealth of a handful of large banks. It actually had the opposite effect of what they said they were trying to do.
Mr. Kopser.
Well, this is another example where the experience that I have in the real world with the company that I built and the jobs that we created is an evidence of what we need more of in our Congress. People who are coming from other professions and skills, teachers, laborers, business people, entrepreneurs, medical professionals, to get in there and create new opportunities. Because if they understood, just like I knew in my business, that the money we raised, the investments we took were risks, but that risk fell on us and our investors, not to be passed through to the taxpayers. It's because the people that have been in Washington for so long lose that connection to how the real world actually works. And let's bring in a new generation to understand that when you're dealing with money and people's money, you need to understand that that is a risk that comes, and you need to be responsible, not just expect that the taxpayers are going to bail you out. And that is something that I want to make sure we do, is bring in new opportunity to solve these problems and get back to the reality of the day.
Gentlemen, that is all the time that we have for questions. So we will now move on to closing statements. You each have 3 minutes to tell the fine folks here and those watching why they should elect you on November 6th. Mr. Kopser, we will begin with you.
Thank you. I want to thank the Austin Chamber, the San Marcos Chamber, and KView, and yourself, Ashley, for being a part of this. This is what democracy looks like. We have to have a conversation, a civil conversation, as we did today, about the contrasts that are before us going forward in the future. There was a real political awakening in 2016. Millions of Americans who did not participate on the left or on the right or in every part in between. And what they all seem to be saying is that what we have today is not good enough. And what I want to do is be a part of a new generation of problem solvers. People willing to go in and roll up their sleeves and work across the aisle. People who didn't grow up on the Republican team or on the Democratic team, or people like me who grew up on the Army team, who are looking at ways to find solutions. So whether it's the problems I solved in the everyday work I did in the Army, not just what you see on TV and the trips to Iraq and combat, but the everyday work, working with soldiers and their families to make sure they have what they need so that no one falls through the cracks. To make sure that in business that we're smart about hiring, trying to find the best and most dedicated workforce you can, trained and ready for the economy of the 21st century. These are all things I've done in reality, that I've had to face those decisions of hiring and firing. And with my 3 daughters, Keaton, Hadley, and Piper, and raising them in the public education system, not just here in Texas, but in the 9 different places across the United States as the Army moved me around. My wife and I have had to not only raise this family, but also pay bills. We've had to go with the risk and the dread that she felt when I deployed overseas, but also the stress of building a company. And those are everyday Texas values that I believe we can all agree on. And what we need less of is the politics of division. To win this race, this is a race I've said from the primary to the general, will require independents, Democrats, and Republicans work together. I seek out opportunities to work with Republicans and independents in the same way I do with Democrats. But the politics of division from people who are more willing to score points are what keep us from getting progress. Americans willing to put country over party are needed more than ever. And frankly, in this swamp-like backlash we had of 2016, when it's time to bring in a new generation of workers and public servants, this is a time to seize. And for those Republicans who are concerned whether or not they can vote for a Democrat for the first time, it's real easy. Don't think of me as a Democrat. Think of me as a public servant, a veteran, a father of 3 daughters, a businessman. And at the end, if I can cross oceans and deserts in service to my country, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I can cross the aisle when needed to work with those who want to solve the problems in Washington. Thank you very much.
Mr. Roy.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for hosting this event. Thank you for moderating. Thank you all for being here. And Joseph, thank you for joining me here today, and thank you for running. 7 years ago this week, maybe last week, my wife might know, I was declared cancer-free after being in chemotherapy at MD Anderson instead of being on the campaign trail with Governor Perry, which is where I was supposed to be at the time in 2011, and finished treatment in January, and was reinvigorated and re-inspired to serve publicly and to engage to make sure that I save this republic, as Benjamin Franklin famously asked us whether it was a republic if we can keep it, for my 2 children and all of our children. My daughter Virginia and my son Charlie, who are here. That's why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because it's time for Congress to work for us. It's time for Congress to work for the people. I believe it's time for our Texas values that are working in Texas so much to be reflected in Washington. My Texas values were seeded here early when my family came to this area in 1851. My great-great-great-grandparents moved here. My great-great-grandmother, Virginia, my daughter's namesake, was born in San Marcos in 1857. My great-great-grandfather was a Texas Ranger in Hays, Blanco, and Travis counties. And that was a time in Texas when you had to be tough. He signed up to deal with Comanche hostilities. This was a time when you had 110-degree days and you had tough, environments with no water and a temperature you had to deal with. You didn't go down the street and go buy a box fan or an air conditioning unit, right? You had to go figure out how to deal with it. You had to deal with the problems in front of you. Those are the Texas values that made us great. The same Texas values that led to when my great-grandparents were out west. My grandfather was the chief of police of Sweetwater. He died of cancer when my dad was 7, had polio. My grandmother was a single mom in West Texas. She did multiple jobs, figured out how to get up in the morning, help my dad walk. He's here today, and he's still walking at 75. Became the first woman elected county clerk in Nolan County, Texas in the early 1950s. Those are the values that were passed down to me. That's why my dad went on to college. That's what enabled me to go on and succeed. Those are the values that I want to preserve and protect in Texas. We can have a debate about a lot of these issues that my opponent raises. Rightfully so. Education and other issues. I think those should be debated predominantly locally. I believe the federal government needs to do its job, defend the United States, make sure we've got a strong military, a clear mission, the tools they need and the care when they get home. Make sure we secure the border so that it's good for our country, our economy, and the immigrants in question. Make sure that we have healthcare freedom to get the doctors of our choice, the healthcare choosing, have health savings accounts, health sharing ministries and organizations to spread the wealth, and have insurance that you can carry from one job to the next. We can do all of that if we get the federal government to stop interfering with our ability as people to do that. That's what I want for our country. And then I want Washington to get out of the way. Reunite the United States of America under our core convictions. Make sure that Texas can be Texas, let California be California, and let's all reunite under our core shared values under the Constitution. That's why I'm running for Congress. That's why I'd love to have your vote. Thank you so much.
Gentlemen, we thank you both for joining us today. And again, we want to thank our partners, the Greater Austin and San Marcos Area Chambers of Commerce, as well as our host for today's event, Google Fiber. Now, before we say goodbye, we want to remind you that Debate Day on KVUE continues tonight with the last scheduled debate between those two Texas U.S. Senate candidates, Senator Ted Cruz and Democrat Congressman Beto O'Rourke. Now, you can watch that debate live on KVUE at 8 o'clock tonight. And most importantly, please don't forget to go vote. Early voting begins next Monday, October 22nd, and runs through Friday, November 2nd, Election Day. Everybody knows what day it is, right? Oh, say it with conviction. November 6th. Yes, well, I like to go on the day. It makes me feel good. Okay, so, and of course, we also want to remind you that you can find all the information you need about all of the races in Central Texas, as well as the when, where, and what you need to vote at kvue.com/votetexas. We thank you again for joining us today. You all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.